I'm going to go ahead and get started. Hello, and welcome to another Miko Peled hosted webinar. My name is Jamil, and I'll be introducing today's event. The title for today's event is The Palestinian Refugees, Rights, Reality, and Return. I will also be facilitating the Q&A portion after the panel's discussion finishes up. We're going probably for about an hour today, so 60 minutes discussion, 30 minutes Q&A. And today's discussion really is centered on the status and fate of the over 7 million Palestinian refugees who are scattered throughout the world today as a result of Israel's creation in 1948. So this diaspora persists as one of the most politically contested refugee crises of our time. And we are very fortunate today to have two authors of the new book, Palestinian Refugees in International Law, by Francesca P. Albanese and Lex Takkenberg. They're going to share their research, their insights, while providing a comprehensive analysis of the Palestinian refugee question in light of various areas of international law. The third member of our panel today, we're rounded out by, if you've been following Miko, hopefully a familiar face, familiar voice. We had him on our podcast very early on. I encourage everyone to go back and check out that episode. You could just look for the Miko Peled podcast. I had to get that plug in. So we have with us Umar al-Ghubari of Zochrot. Zochrot is an NGO working towards the reconceptualization of the return. And really the goal today is to gain a foundation in understanding the rights of Palestinian refugees as protected by international law. We want to examine the role of Israel in the international community within this context, and we want to envision what return could look like. So much thanks to the panel today for being with us. Francesca is all the way in Jakarta, so it's at an ungodly hour, so we appreciate your diligence and commitment to the cause. Of course, author and activist Miko Peled is today's host. And I want to thank the audience as well for joining us for this live, very important discussion. We are live streaming this to Miko's Facebook page. So just go to facebook.com/Miko Peled official. If you'd like to watch us on Facebook or share it with your audience, we do encourage, even if you're watching this live on Zoom, to go ahead and share that on Facebook so that other people can get in on it. We will begin the audience Q&A after the discussion wraps up, so hopefully about 60 minutes. So use that Q&A button at the bottom to get your question in. We'll try to get through as many as we can. The last thing I want to mention is I want to plug Umar's group, Zochrot, has a fundraiser that they just launched. The campaign is called 48 Hours to Acknowledge for the Acknowledgement of the Nakba of 1948. So they are aiming to raise $100,000 by Tuesday, November 24th. This will allow Zochrot to expand their activities, to be more independent, and to promote the recognition of the Nakba and right to return within Israeli society. So that campaign is live now, and we would love everyone's help in either donating or maybe sharing it with your networks. You can actually find out more about this campaign and donate directly by going to isupportzochrot.org, and I'll spell that out for you. It's Zochrot. I'm also going to put this link in the chat, and it will also be in the post email for this event coming up. So we'd appreciate any support you can give to the fantastic Zochrot. And I think that's going to do it for me. So I'm going to pass the reins over to Miko.
Thank you, Jamil. And hi, everybody, all the participants, and Lex, Francesca, and Omar, thank you so much for your valuable time and your knowledge. And so the topic of the refugees is one that is, on the one hand, central to the Palestinian issue and central to any envisioned solution to the Palestinian issue. And at the same time, something that's been kind of pushed to the background and dealt with as though it's something that we shouldn't really expect will ever happen. It's like a bridge too far. It's always being pushed off to the back. And so it's got this very, very strange dynamic. And there's a quote that I want to find here real quick by Volker Bernadotte, who was the he was central.
Mediator.
I'm sorry, the mediator. Yeah, the mediator that was sent to Palestine and then consequently assassinated by Zionist terrorists. And he said that he's, and this is in your book. He said no settlement can be just and complete if recognition is not accorded to the right of the refugees to return. And I think that's something that a lot of people feel. But then again, it's been pushed to the background. And then your book, Lex and Francesca, the legal aspects of the Palestinian issue, or the Palestinians refugees in international law. I found it to be just a remarkable resource in realizing just how strong the case of the Palestinian refugees really are in terms of international law, and how the responsibility of the state of Israel is to this issue, and that not only did the passing of time not weaken the case, but it has in fact become stronger. And there are many, many facets of this issue that your book reveals, which I think people are going to find fascinating and extremely important to this issue. And so I wanted to bring that up, this issue, the strength of the legal case, and at the same time, talk about how we envision, or how the return can be envisioned, and Umar with the Zochrot and the sense of or the project of envisioning the return and what it's going to look like. So that's why I got all of you here together to really discuss both of these issues, because I think they're extremely important, and I think one leads to the other naturally. If there is a strong legal case, then naturally we need to start envisioning it and start working on it, or else it's going to remain kind of an academic issue and pushed to the background. And I want to start with a quote from the book, which again I found to be extremely enlightening. And the quote is that there needs to be a fundamental change in the way Palestinian refugees are seen, no longer as victims, but as people with rights who are entitled to shape their own destiny. And I thought we'd go around, and perhaps Lex, start with you, since you wrote the book initially, the first edition, and if you can talk about that and how it, how it connects to your work in general and to the book.
Thank you very much, Miko, and thank you to both you and Jamal for the opportunity, and thank you also, Miko, for your review of the book. I think you were the first to at least the first that we are aware of that did a review. So thanks a lot. Let me perhaps start indeed by how I came to write the book over 20 years ago in the first place. I had worked as a young legal officer for the Dutch Refugee Council for a number of years before coming to the Middle East. And in that role, I was organizing frequent meetings for lawyers, attorneys on issues of refugee law and asylum. And from time to time, questions came up on Palestinian refugees, and there was sort of, a blank. Nobody knew what to sort of say, look for literature. There was very little. Fast forward, I joined UNRWA in early 1989 to work in a program in response to the first Intifada. First sort of endeavor of UNRWA to start trying to do some protection in the face of sort of the violence that erupted between Palestinians and Israelis late 1987 onwards. And after a year, I was asked to sort of contribute an article for the Journal of Refugee Law, reflecting on UNRWA's protection experience. And when I was sort of researching that article, I realized there were whole libraries written about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, including legal studies, but at the time nothing about the question of the Palestinian refugees. And I thought, you know, this was a lacuna, and I thought it was a great subject also for a PhD. And I was working at a time in Gaza. I spent most of the 90s in Gaza, and you know, had as a result had quite some time in the evenings to work on this project, and that's how it came about. And indeed, I realized how you know, the rights of the Palestinian refugees, and especially also their specific rights of return, restitution, compensation, you know, were ill understood. I also realized when working on the second edition that I had not fully understood them at the time, and I remember very well that I got some sort of quite critical reviews, including from Norman Finkelstein, saying, you know, you got the right of return all wrong, and I did, and we have fixed it in the new edition. So yes, it was a journey to realize how actually strong the rights of the refugees are, and how at the same time in the whole political discourse, as you quite rightly said, you know, on the one hand, the centrality of the refugee issue is at the heart of the unresolved conflict. On the other hand, pushed to the background, thought as an afterthought in all the political discussions, and that is, I believe, you know, one of the largest shortcomings of the Oslo process, that from the UN, which, you know, was responsible for the question of Palestine, including since 48, 49, the refugee issue. You know, it went through the first Camp David I to a regional approach, to a bilateral approach, where as a result of the asymmetry of power, you know, no progress whatsoever was booked. And one of the key things that one of the key points that we're making in the book is that it needs to get back into the center of the UN, and guided by international law, as international law guides solutions, protection, and other responses for all other refugees the world over. All we argue for is that this is the same for the Palestinian refugee question as for starters.
And Francesca, can you talk about this as well? Thank you, Lex, about this this need for the fundamental change in the way the refugees are seen.
Yeah, let me start with two anecdotes, which are also, I mean, connected to what motivated me to work with Lex on a new edition of the Palestinian refugee situation. One is that when I spent a few years with UNRWA, as you know, within my decade with the United Nations, and then I could witness personally not only the discrimination that Palestinians were often exposed to because of their legal status, and the confusion around it, and the poor knowledge of the Palestinian refugee situation across the border. I mean, it was something that, I mean, I'm not talking necessarily of something in UNRWA, but in my interaction through UNRWA with people, with other lawyers, with people working in the international human rights system. I mean, this thing of hearing over and over, yeah, but Palestinian refugees are not real refugees, or Palestinian refugees are not covered by the 1951 Convention. I mean, it triggered something in me, saying, how come that people just don't get it. And at the same time, I realized that although compared to when Lex started writing this book 22 years ago, his first edition 22 years ago, now there is much more knowledge about, I mean, legal knowledge, not knowledge about the Palestinian refugee question, because I think that has always existed. It's just about the legal studies dealing with the Palestinian refugee question. There is still a fragmentation in approaching this issue. And in the sense that the existing research deals with either Palestinian refugees within the peace process, specific rights, right, like the rights of return, right of compensation, and then we can debate how our approach to the right of return differs from others. Or Palestinian refugees in Egypt, Palestinian refugees in Lebanon. But what I realized through my own experience is that the Palestinian dispersal has grown much larger and much bigger than, and was no longer limited to the Near East, to the Middle East, to the Arab world, or to Europe and Americas. To an extent, it had extended, and so had the frontiers of their exile. And now I speak from Indonesia. There are thousands of Palestinians in Malaysia, in Thailand, in Indonesia, and this is as far as they go to seek protection. So this is the first thing I wanted to share. I had the feeling that something more, that the overall picture was missing. And the Oslo process, to comment on what Lex said, has contributed to the fragmentation, because in the international community, people tend to associate whatever is Palestinian to the self-determination, unresolved self-determination question, which is very important, but it doesn't exhaust by itself all the claims and all the rights that Palestinian refugees have related to the historical injustice that befell them in 1947 and even more earlier, in 1947, 1949, and since then. The second anecdote happened in Jerusalem. I had already agreed with Lex that I would be the co-author of his second edition, and I was invited as an observer to a closed-door seminar about 1948 refugees. And I asked one of the Israeli convener, why had they, I mean, I thought it was a brave thing to talk about Palestinian refugees in Jerusalem. And he said, well, you know, it's such an old topic. But it's good that we talk about that old topic. I mean, and this was telling. It was one of these fleeting moments where one realizes, okay, this is really needed, and I need to do my job here. So I really put my heart and mind at work over the past 4 years to provide that overall picture. And this book is enriched with new archival research, building on the research of others, but bringing everything together, trying to really pull all the string, the historical, political, and through the legal lens, try to make sense of all these. So to answer your question, a paradigm shift is desperately needed, because Palestinians, not only, as you say, have been demoted from the political discussion. I mean, they are treated as a nuisance at best, as an obstacle to peace. Why on earth? This doesn't happen to any other. I mean, there are other protracted refugee situations. In this sense, the Palestinian case is not unique. But why can't we talk about the refugees? Why can't we talk about their rights? And why can't we talk about justice? Because of political issues. And so we wanted to address these issues and demonstrate a principled approach to get out of the impasse. And also, we do think that the United Nations, as Lex said, and not United Nations as UN, the international community holds a responsibility vis-a-vis the refugees, not only because it does so vis-a-vis all refugees. Eventually, I mean, refugees are a sort of a trigger beyond the responsibility of states, because are people who need responsibility or who need protection that they don't get from their state. But also, the UN was somewhat responsible to create or to participate in the creation of this problem. And we shouldn't forget that. And this is also another issue why we wanted to bring the legal lens in. And we also think, third and last point I wanted to make, that international law has not been applied to Palestinian refugees, not only vis-à-vis Israel, but everywhere they are. They've experienced a discrimination that is the reflex of politicization, and this reflects the disempowerment that many of them face. And I'm happy to return to this because I think this is crucial to our discussion.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's crucial, and I think that's why I like this quote so much. And I put it up front, you know, to start the conversation. And Omar, I'm going to read this quote again. I'm going to add something that I took from Zochrot, from the vision, and ask you to comment on that. So again, there needs to be a fundamental change in the way Palestinian refugees are seen, no longer as victims, but as people with rights who are entitled to shape their own destiny. And it seems to me that that's exactly what you're doing with a vision of return, where you talk about, you say, as part of the understanding in the meaning of the feasibility of return, it must be imagined and planned. So I wanted to add that and let you comment on both of these aspects, most of these, if you will.
Yeah, thank you very much, first of all, for organizing this discussion. I think it's very important. And thanks, Lex and Francesca, for your significant book. It's not for granted to have this material and this literature about the right of the Palestinian refugees in the political climate in the and the power relation in the international community. We don't hear the voices that are talking about the rights of the Palestinian refugees almost anymore. I really appreciate this book and this way to expose the Palestinian refugees' rights. And it's well connected to our work, as Miko mentioned. And we try in our teaching or learning or exposing the issues of the Palestinian refugees issues, starting from the disaster of 1948, the beginning of the Nakba, talking about the ongoing Nakba and the violation of the rights of the Palestinians in general, mainly the Palestinian refugees, and preventing their return, and to expose the right. And we are very encouraged now to read more authors talking about the international law that back up actually the right to return, because there is a big debate among experts if the Palestinian refugees deserve the right to return. And the next step that we try to take this issue is not only to talk about the right and to discuss in theory what is the right, but also to create kind of imagination, kind of planning, kind of designing the future, including the practical return, which means that in this way we catch two birds, we catch two issues. One of them to maintain and to keep the issue of the right of the return and the issue of the refugees, Palestinian refugees, on the table, but not only kind of a dream or a goal that no one is able to achieve. We want to talk about it as a practical issue, a practical step and political step based on the information that we know already about the numbers and the rights and the international law support for the right to return. When we checked the issue of the return, maybe many of you know already, we of course faced the Israeli taboo about talking even of course, acknowledging the right to return, but even not to talk about it. And on the other side, on the other hand, we faced also the Palestinian dream and the Palestinian fantasy about the return. And when we looked in the international community and even in the Palestinian institutions, we did not find any program or any political action for the implementation of the return. So we said this is the point that we want to expose and actually to jump upon the Israeli fears and the Israeli taboo and the fantasy of the or the dream of the Palestinians to return to their homeland as they imagine the homeland looked like it was in 1948. We found that the return should have a program, a plan, and based on the research on the ground to go and to look and to check what happened on the ground with the Palestinian localities, the Palestinian villages and Palestinian cities and the Palestinian neighborhoods, because the return will be into different Palestine, to different reality. It's not return to the lost paradise. It's not return to the same village that was in 1948. We should acknowledge that 70 years passed from since the moment that the Palestinians were expelled to the, we hope, few years to the moment that the Palestinians were returned. So this gap should be researched, and this gap should be a part of the discussion and part of the action plan that should be given for the future, including the right to return. Of course, during the process of studying the practicalities of return, we by ourselves learned many new elements that we didn't know and we were not aware about the difficulties and the obstacles on the way of the implementation of return, but of course we will talk about them very soon. The other point that we live here in the colonial entity, we live here in the situation of the policy of the State of Israel. Zochrot is based in Tel Aviv and tries to expose the Nakba and the responsibility of the Israeli society and the Israeli and the State of Israel on the Nakba and the acknowledgement of return. So in one hand, we want to challenge the Israeli perceptions towards the responsibility about the Palestinian ethnic cleansing and the responsibility of the Israeli side for the return of the Palestinian refugees. But at the same time, we must say that the last word and the last decision and the last design that we want to have is the right, is the refugees themselves perception. We can handle workshops for the Israelis and the international activists about the practical return and how do they imagine the return and how do they want it to look like. But the last word should be to the Palestinian refugees themselves, because they have the right to return and they have the right to shape their future and their localities in the situation of return, even if it's still just in their imagination. But this is the whole meaning in our point of view, the whole meaning of the right of the Palestinians to return. It's not only to walk back to their place, but also to have the right to shape their place and to decide how it will look like and how it will influence the whole environment over here. Of course, we are not naive to say that it is simple and easy. We are aware that the return will and should influence and affect the demographic situation, the political situation, the economic situation, and all the fields and all the aspects of life. This is part of the meaning of return. If we want to plan it from now, we should also plan the other aspects of the return effects and influences on the real life.
Yeah, well, one of the things that each and every one of you touched on, and I want to press all three of you on it, maybe Lex, I'll start with you, is has to do with the fact that, or the statement, I should say, that for political reasons, the refugees have some kind of a distinct, in the book you call it a distinctive regime, made up of specific norms and institutional arrangements, and that have excluded them, or that they are excluded from the rights and standards of treatment afforded to other refugees. This is a very, very strong statement, I think. This statement says a lot. So Lex, why don't you comment, and then Francesca, and then Omar will go through the same.
Yeah, Francesca is the expert here, but let me start by saying that in the first edition, I was still sort of talking about sort of a partial exclusion from the international refugee regime, and in the second edition, upon further reflection and realizing and being able to access further historic documents, we refer to it as a distinctive regime, because we recognize that, you know, the Palestinian refugees are not children of a lesser god. They're as much refugees in the international regime. They're acknowledged in the 1951 Refugee Convention, in the Statute of UNHCR, in the 1954 Statelessness Convention, as much as other categories of then already existing refugees were in the aftermath of the Second World War. So we emphasize that indeed there are specific institutional arrangements. So Francesca is much better placed to elaborate. There is UNRWA. There was, following the assassination of Count Bernadotte, where you mentioned in your introduction, the UN General Assembly replaced the mandate of an individual mediator with that of a commission, the Conciliation Commission for Palestine, chaired by the US, with France and Turkey as other members, and that started to work towards a resolution of the overall conflict, including the refugee issue. And in order to assist it specifically with the refugee issue, the UNCCP was then instrumental, in particular the Americans, in creating UNRWA as a special agency to, on the one hand, to continue ongoing emergency relief, what we today call humanitarian assistance for the refugees who were still in dire, for the majority of the refugees who at the time were still in dire conditions, and at the same time support the UNCCP in after it tried to effect return in the early days of its existence, to work towards alternatives through local integration, through limited forms of resettlement, etc. So we paint this quite unique regime for Palestinian refugees, emphasizing and elaborating that once again, that as much refugees as all other refugees are around the world. Francesca, let me push you. I want to push you just a little bit further. If you can touch on what is this specific regime? What are these specific norms that they are that has been placed, and also what are these political reasons? What are the political reasons that the Palestinians are placed in this unique situation?
You read my mind. So what I was in fact planning to add on what Lex said is, let me clarify what is the distinctiveness, distinct to what, from what. So today, we know that the international refugee regime consists of UNHCR, like the global body, the universal body mandated to protect refugees, and the 1951 Convention, which defines refugees as those fleeing, being outside their country of nationality or habitual residence, and for a number of reasons, and unwilling or unable to return out of fear of persecutions. And the Palestinian refugees clearly do not fall under the, at large, the Palestinian refugees from 1948 and 1967 do not fall into this category of being unwilling or unable to return out of fear of persecution, because they would be willing to return, most probably. We don't know. As Umar said, we need to ask the refugees first and foremost. So these two facts have led to one of the largest misconceptions in refugee studies, that somewhat Palestinians are lesser refugees than others, or are no refugees at all, and therefore entitled to different or no protection. This is wrong. So the distinctive regime has historical and political reasons. In 1948-49, so when the drafting of the 1951 Convention was clearly still on the way, the United Nations had already decided how to deal with the Palestinian refugee crisis, and how, as Lex mentioned, after the assassination of the UN mediator, who, by the way, had recommended first and foremost the return of the refugees, the General Assembly created the UNCCP, the United Nations Conciliation Commission for Palestine. This body had two functions. It was established under Resolution 1 and 4. And it had to deal with a comprehensive solution of the of the question of Palestine, including the issue of refugees, together with the demilitarization, the issue of borders, the issue of holy places and Jerusalem, and so on. It was a very complex situation, including the refugee file. And I can tell you, reading the historical sources tells you that back then, the complex issue was not the refugee, because in everyone's mind, the refugees were sort of, apart from Israel, the refugees were to be returned, to be allowed to return, unless they didn't want to. In that case, they would have to be resettled. So this is just to say how the perspective has shifted. However, the UN Conciliation Commission was to find a solution to the question of Palestine, including to the refugees. How? Paragraph 11 of Resolution 1 and 4. Either the return of the refugees willing to live at peace, so not to engage in armed conflict with the Jewish neighbors, and compensation and resettlement for those not willing to return. So it was a scheme for durable solution. It was the first scheme for durable solution in modern history. And this didn't happen because peace was unattainable in the short term. And therefore, another body was created, which was, other bodies, in fact, were created. And the most lasting one of those is UNRWA. UNRWA was created to provide assistance to the refugees in need for relief, but also to support the role of the UNCCP towards solutions. While I'm saying all that, just to say that before the 1951 Convention, these two bodies had already been created. And bear in mind that back then, 70 years ago, ad hoc responses to refugee situations were not at all exceptional. They were the norm. This is how refugee crisis had been dealt with until that point. And even the 1951 Convention was not the universal document that we know today. It became so over time because it was conceived for European refugees and Soviet refugees at that time. And UNHCR was to deal with these refugees. And let me give concrete examples. The Korean refugees and India-Pakistani refugees, together with the Palestinian refugees, meaning all the territorial partitions refugee crisis were outside the scope of UNHCR. And there were ad hoc agencies, like in the case of Palestinians and the Korean refugees, or bilateral agreements, like in the case of the Indian-Pakistani. So the 1951 Convention, which referred implicitly to refugees served by other UN agencies to be protected by those agencies until their question is settled, is a norm that recognizes the status of the legal status of Palestinian refugees as internationally protected refugees, but under other arrangements. And I explained why, because they were already there. No one 70 years ago could expect that the Palestinian refugee question would not be resolved. And today they are the only situation where there are ad hoc agencies like UNRWA and UNCCP, which is de facto not functioning. This is the exceptionality, on top of the fact that the root causes that led to the displacement and dispossession of the Palestinians in 1947-1949 have not been addressed and have multiplied, sort of magnified, in continuing until present to create dispossession and displacement. So I hope the distinctiveness is clear. What it means today is that there is UNRWA, but there is also UNHCR. There is a clear interpretation nowadays put forward by UNHCR and supported by UNRWA of the Article 1D of the Geneva Convention, which again does not exclude refugees, is the norm that provisionally allows other agencies to deal with Palestinian refugees, but recognize them as refugees. And what I'm saying is supported by the drafting history of the 1951 Convention, which is a legal tool is a tool for legal interpretation of the treaty. And so these bodies, the UNHCR and UNRWA interpret their mandate as complementary vis-a-vis Palestinian refugees, rather than antithetical or contradictory. So within UNRWA's areas of operation, UNRWA is responsible. And when Palestinian refugees are outside this area, for objective reasons, they need international protection, they fall under UNHCR scope. Is this system satisfactory? Of course not, but this is up for discussion.
Yeah, excellent. This is fascinating stuff. And I think, the political issue I want to push, Umar, I want to push you a little bit more. You talked about the taboo of speaking about the return, and I know that having grown up in Israeli society. And you also, in talking about envisioning the return, one of the statements that is made on the website is that we envision a return to a democratic state grounded in values of freedom and equality. The future state will not have a sovereign national Jewish character, but will allow the expression of an autonomous collective identity, and so on. So this is a pretty daring vision, and of course, I think it touches on the political issue, both on the one hand, the taboo to even discuss it in Israeli society, and on the other hand, this vision of a return to a completely different political reality in Palestine, and combining that with the reality in which the refugees exist as a result of because of political issues. So this is many layers here of complication. So can you talk about what are your thoughts about that, and how do we get beyond that?
Yeah, well, let me just add to what Francesca said. I can say in my understanding very simply that the international community created the problem of the Palestinian refugees. So I feel that they felt more responsibility or special responsibility in order to resolve their problem. In 1947, November 1947, the United Nations created the Palestinian Nakba, the Palestinian ethnic cleansing, and the Palestinian refuge by the partitioning plan that was approved in the United Nations. And I feel because of that special issue, creating a Jewish state in Palestine by the United Nations led to the special responsibility of the international community towards the Palestinian refugees. But It's not the simple meaning that sometimes Israelis or Zionists will argue this this issue. The Palestinian refugees are not spoiled refugees and the only case in the world that deserve return. The default right and the default solution is to let refugees to go back to their homes. And this is what did not happen to the Palestinians. Almost totally, 100% were prevented to return by the state of Israel. In other cases in the history, refugees could go back, except some exceptional cases when the regimes or the governments agreed different decisions, but it was not human decisions. It's not, and in these days, if you look at other refugees communities in the world, the United Nations, the UNHCR, acting in order to return or to help or to support refugees to return. I just looked, and I can add to the examples that Somalian refugees in Kenya have in these days, since 2014 till today, they have a very fantastic return program supported by the United Nations and the government of Kenya. And when the situation in Somalia getting better, so more and more refugees can go back. I see that since 2014, about 40,000 Somalian refugees returned to their country. And there are 1 million Somalian refugees in Kenya, and they are living there and they suffering from the refuge for 30 years. So the question of the Palestinian descendants that always raised as a question or as a question mark, because they are not refugees, they were not expelled by themselves, by their body from their homeland. It's not the definition for the Palestinian refugees only. There are other communities like the Somali refugees and the Afghan refugees in Iran living for second and third generation, and they're still considered refugees according to the United Nations. So it's not only the Palestinians who the other thing. One group of Palestinian refugees is forgotten from our discussion and from the international law, which is the internal displaced people, refugees inside the state of Israel. 25% of the Palestinian citizens in Israel are actually internal refugees. They were expelled in 1948 from their original villages and towns. And despite the fact that they became citizens of the state, they were not allowed to go back to their places. That will lead me just to mention one more point, that the demographic situation is not the only reason why Israel preventing the return of the Palestinian refugees. I believe that it's more racist. It fits the colonial and the ideology of the Zionist movement as a colonial movement, because the Zionist movement does not acknowledge the ownership of the Palestinians to their own land or villages. They don't acknowledge that Palestinian people is a people that belong to that place. So they even treat the Palestinian citizens of Israel in this way. If you are living now in Nazareth, for example, for the Israeli government, it's not big deal if you live in Nazareth, not in your original village like Safuri. We just moved you from one place to other place. You can live as a citizen, you can rent an apartment, and they don't consider the link and the national link of the Palestinian to this place, to this land, which actually makes sense because they believe that this land belongs to the Jewish people and not for others. not for the Palestinians. So I think it's when the demographic issue will raise up, which is just one aspect, but I think the reasons is wider and larger than the demographic situation. When we talk about the Israeli taboo, mainly the Israelis will raise the demographic issue obstacle, but we try to expose that it's not only that that issue. From this black situation, we, as I said in the beginning, try to let people or to invite people to imagine what will be, what really could happen to the people and to the land and to the area when the refugees will come back. So we try to, by the way, there's a new trend of training the imagination. You can train your imagination in different ways and in different directions in order to create a political program. We use the imagination as a resistance, as a political resistance, in order to offer different solutions and just solutions for the issue of the refugees and the return and the people who will live in this landscape based on justice. So we try to learn what are the positive aspects of the return. First of all, the Israeli fault that return will cause a new Holocaust for the Jewish community here living in Palestine or now in Israel is a big fault. If we try to let even the Israelis, but also the Palestinians, to imagine the future in this kind of workshops, not only to be stuck in the myth of destruction or new expulsion, we do say that let's try to imagine the landscape based on the right to return, and let's try to design one specific local place. So we took some villages, Palestinian destroyed villages inside the state of Israel, and we asked them just to build that and to imagine people coming and living there. In these practices, in this mechanism, we didn't hear a lot about destruction and killing people and expelling people. We just felt that people can try imagine future with different political solutions, but out of the box. When we going out of the known terminology and known political ideas, we can find more just solutions and more feasible solutions, including the right to return. Even Palestinian refugees themselves managed to build their villages, taking in their view and their future situation that they will live in a place with Jewish communities in the same landscape. Of course, the Zionism and the Israeli regime will not be in their imagination. They will not be, well, it couldn't be the political solution with Zionism, but Palestinians could have this split between Zionism and Judaism and Jewish communities or Israeli colonizers. So when they had managed to split and to see the differences between these both identities, they managed to imagine a future, shared future or mixed society in their places. To start the process gradually, we took empty localities, not empty in the Zionist meaning, but empty because there are hundreds of Palestinian villages which are destroyed, but they are located inside Israeli forests and GNF parks and military bases. So these examples of empty places, I mean, there is no people living in these destroyed Palestinian villages. They are the majority of the Palestinian villages that were expelled in 1948. So if we start to imagine these areas as a new place for return, not only as a place for telling the disaster or telling the history or telling the Nakba, but as optional place for return, we found that many people opened their minds and they started to fantasize for the future. The obstacles that we see in these practices are a little bit ironic. The people who feel that this will be utopia and the people who feel that this will be dystopia, both are actually telling us not to think about the return. So we want to take the right to return from the utopia to the practical aspects, and in the same way to show that it will not be dystopia. Actually, what in Greek says, let's talk about topia. Topia is the place, because utopia saying there is no place. It's not applicable, it's not feasible, it's not possible. We try to go between the utopia and the dystopia to the utopia and to show and to search that it is possible and applicable.
Thank you for that. Yeah. So you talked about Umar, you talked about the different reasons why Israelis don't like the idea or refuse to even discuss the idea of return. And in the book, Lex and Francesca, you bring up something that again, another aspect of this issue that is central, and I think not a lot is known about it, and that is the wealth that the Palestinians left behind. The Zionists, of course, claim that they made the desert bloom, and the Palestinians say, as they say in Arabic, "Akhaduha mafrusha." They took it all furnished. And what your book shows, that not only it was furnished, but it was furnished, lavishly furnished. And I believe the quote, the way you present it in the book, is that the wealth Palestinians left behind was strategic to the emerging state of Israel. And then you talk about how the Palestinians left behind huge tracts of farmland, tools, livestock, shops, factories, houses of worship, private homes, financial assets, and personal belongings. Produce from fields and orchards was also left behind, with large citrus fruit stores waiting to be exported for hard currency. So I think it's not outrageous to assume that one of the fears that the Zionist institutions and the state of Israel among them have is that somebody's going to come and say, excuse me, you've taken all this wealth, it's time to pay back. So can you talk, perhaps Lex, you can talk a little bit more about that wealth and what does international law say in terms of how is this resolved?
Well, yes, it's a key point, and I think it also goes to the heart as to why the right of return and issues of compensation and restitution are such a taboo. You know, whatever good reasons there may have been for the founding fathers, or, you know, to create a state of Israel, the reality is that it went at the expense of another people, and that historical justice needs to be made good. In the book, we show that, you know, the right of return and compensation and restitution doesn't flow from this resolution 194, and there has been a lot of debate whether that's a binding resolution, etc. But it's very simple. It goes back to the law of wars that was already developed at least 50 years earlier, to an extent that in the aftermath of the Second World War, when the charter of the Nuremberg and Tokyo tribunals was written, and when the judges applied the charter, mass expulsion in time of war was considered a war crime under the existing international humanitarian law, prevailing at the time. And it was only a few years later that Resolution 194 was carefully elaborated in the fall of 1948. And the lawyers who were sort of working on it didn't see the need to, create a right of return because it was already there. So that's the first thing, and I think that goes to the back of the mind of every Israeli. They know it's not theirs. They know it needs to be made good, and that's, I think, why it's such a deep taboo and so difficult to discuss it. Now, at the time of the first edition of the book, there was Oslo. There was still we were still naively optimistic that there might be a opportunity for a two-state solution for the establishment of a Palestinian state, and I thought that practically that would imply that the right of return would turn into a right to live in the Palestinian state to be. Now, since Oslo, we have seen that the two-state solution is becoming less and less likely. It's currently sort of on life support, still, referred to, out of politeness from time to time, but everybody knows that it is no longer within reach, and we're currently facing a one-state reality. So in that current reality, the right of return, which, as I indicated, stems from the historic injustice and the violation of international humanitarian law as it stood at the time, has turned into claims to live in the totality of historic Palestine, and if a two-state solution is no longer possible, as is the case, it indeed, in line with the program of Zochrot, it becomes a right to live in a democratic Israel-Palestine. As long as that not exists, the struggle for the right of return becomes the struggle for equal rights and for one man, one vote. Ultimately, that's how I see. And I believe that the main drivers of return are those who make who further undermine the possibility of a two-state solution. These are ironically those who work towards realization of a one-state, ultimately democratic reality. Structural injustice won't work. Coming back to the assets that you spoke about. Yes, I believe that very similar to assets that Jews left behind in Germany and other parts of Europe, for which there was a decades-long struggle for compensation and restitution, something similar is likely to happen, should happen, can happen with respect to Palestinian properties that were left behind. And one of the unknown facts of the work of the United Nations Conciliation Commission is that after the Conciliation Commission, realized they could not, it was not likely to make progress to the return of the refugees, it meticulously documented every piece of property, real estate, other properties, up to individual olive trees. They're meticulously documented over a 15-year period by a large staff of the United Nations Conciliation Commission for Palestine. And these documents are all available. When the Conciliation Commission became dormant, they ended up in the basement of the UN Secretariat. In the 70s, they were sort of put on microfilms, at the time the medium of choice. And towards Oslo, they were sort of digitized, and copies were given to Israel, to the Palestinians, to Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. Now, you could not really do anything with it because it's just millions of documents that are stored on electronic media, but you can turn it into a database as is sort of discrete work on that is progressing. You can turn it into a database and ultimately link that to the refugee records that UNRWA has preserved over the same period. I mean, UNRWA has preserved them up till now. And so you can build a resource that the Palestinians can use at the appropriate political time to pursue those historic claims. And I'm absolutely convinced that this will happen, and that this will ultimately yield success. You know, and we believe that this is a key element of the sort of new approach to sort of solution, or to pursue the Palestinian refugee issue anew, that we propose in the final chapter of our book.
Francesca, I wanted to bring something up with you. So we have these two narratives, obviously the opposing narratives. We've got the Zionist narrative of desert that they made bloom, and the Palestinian narrative, which says, you know, they took this country furnished, or like I said, as you described, lavishly furnished. And then when we look at, for example, what Volker Bernadotte said, and I think this is also in the spirit of Resolution 194, that the right of return should be affirmed and made effective, and with the assurance of adequate compensation for property for those who choose not to return. But I didn't see anything. Is there anywhere written about the compensation for the people who do choose to return, but their property was taken, the property has been stolen?
Yeah, so let me give a bit of background, because, so first of all, I would like to make a comment on the passage of the book, Miko, that you read at the beginning. What you quoted is something that is fully documented in the UN archives, the UNCCP archives, as Lex mentioned, but also those archives, I mean, the study on the compensation that Palestinian property lost or left behind that UNCCP carried out is complemented by very important surveys that were also produced around those years by other experts that had worked either within the UNCCP and had complemented that, because at a certain point there was an issue with movable or immovable property, so the UNCCP mainly focused on the immovable property. But we have tried to actualize all these estimates that were made by UNCCP and others, and have also been enriched by studies that were made possible, were produced by experts in the context of the Oslo process. And the figures are quite significant, but it's, again, the point is not that this is unfeasible, because it shouldn't be, because Israel doesn't want, refuses to contribute. The point is that if something is illegal, should be stopped, should cease, and if something has been wrongfully done, should be corrected. So I would like to take one second, because it would be a missed opportunity if we don't clarify that before going to the question of compensation. What is the legal foundation of the right to return, and why we insist that we I mean, we always make a sort of precautionary disclosure to any Palestinians in the room when we talk about the right of return, because we say the Resolution 194 did not create the right of return, so we don't want fierce reactions. The point is that it was not the job of the drafters of the Resolution 194 to create rights. That right already exists, and this is why Volker Bernadotte referred to the right of return. I mean, Zionist pundits are right when they say the right of return didn't exist per se. called, a right called the right to return per se. It doesn't exist today. It's an extension, a corollary of the freedom of movement. But in the case of the Palestinian, it was something else, and it comes from a combination of provision. So we argue that the legal basis of the right of return that guided the drafters of Resolution 194 stems from the prohibition of forced displacement and mass expulsion that constituted already war crimes and crimes against humanity, according, as Lex said, to the Hague resolutions, and as established in the tribunal at Nuremberg and Tokyo years before 1948. So this had already been established, and all the more forced displacement and expulsions and mass expulsions were already criminalized in the charter of the military tribunals. And the Hague regulations were found to be constitutive of customary law by the drafters of the statutes of, the charter of the military tribunals. And Victor Catan, in his book, From Coexistence to Conquest, makes a very important point. It produces all historical evidence that in the Zionist leadership and that before 1948 and between 1948 and 49, so even the Israeli provisional government was aware that there was a criminal liability attached to the conduct of the military operations that were still ongoing in historical Palestine, and there was fear out of it. So this should be kept in mind and should be the core of any legal advocacy on the right to return, because I still see books being written denying the legality of the right. No, it's a right. It's a legal right. And as a lawyer, this is what my job is. I cannot necessarily talk about the feasibility of the right, but the legal basis, it's this one. And let's go to the compensation. The responsibility to correct internationally wrongful act in the forms of restitution is also a principle that was established far before the 1948 events. In 1927, there was the Permanent Court of International Justice, who established that through the famous Zochrot case, that every time there is an internationally wrongful act, there should be a form of reparation as restitution wherever possible, otherwise compensation. The drafters of Resolution 194 knew very well that compensation was to be awarded to everyone. But because back then, and this is all documented historically, there was a dispute ongoing on how to determine what had been lost in the context of the military operations and the conflict between Arab states and Israel, it was determined for convenience then compensation would be only awarded to those choosing not to return. But under principle of law and equity, everyone back then was entitled to receive compensation, and this is what we argue in a book. And of course, what we are saying has only become stronger over time with the entry into force of the Geneva Convention regulating the law of war, with the entry into force of the human rights system, and so on and so forth. What's appalling is that political constraints that prevented the realization of Palestinian rights 70 years ago are still here. And this is what we should also talk about.
Yes. Omar, before I go to you, I want to share an anecdote. You know, the thing is, there is this perception that return could only be possible as a result of Israeli consent, and that we could never have a return, we could never have a democratic Palestine, free Palestine, because Israelis will never agree, and that Israeli consent is somehow central to solving the question of Palestine, which of course I think is absurd. But I've been kind of going back and forth on Twitter with an Israeli war criminal who's also a member of the Knesset. His name is Matan Kahana, and he's a war criminal of unbelievable proportions. He participated in every murderous unit, from being an airline pilot, Air Force pilot, to being a member of a murder squad. Anyway. And now he is this, member of Knesset from the right-wing party.
Recently, he said after bombing in Lebanon, he went home and played music.
Yes, horrible. But he has this, he looks like this very innocent, very pleasant man. He speaks very rationally. And I came upon a video that he posted of himself speaking in an Israeli high school, explaining that he does not live in the West Bank. He lives in 1948 Palestine, where he's explaining that the house that he lives in was built by Palestinians. The well in the yard was dug by Palestinians, and the fruit trees in the yard where he lives were planted by Palestinians, and therefore Israel can never allow itself to drop the gun. Israel must always be well armed and prepared to fight, because even a two-state solution is not going to solve that problem. And so this is the rationale. In other words, he is saying, I am a criminal, I am a thief, I'm sitting on somebody else's land, it is perfectly okay. We just need to make sure that we're strong enough so these people don't come back and try to claim what is actually, and in his mind, because I've been challenging him on this. I'm saying, well, you're admitting that you're a thief, and we know that you're also a murderer. Why are you not in jail? What kind of absurd reality is this? And the reason I'm bringing this up is because we're talking about something that when we compare to his comments and the reality in which Israelis, and I think his comments represent Israelis, by and large, Israeli society, the way Israeli society views the fact that they're sitting on somebody else's land and they're just taking somebody else's homes and so forth, because 2,000 years ago, we're the descendants of this ancient tribe that maybe lived there 2,000 years ago, and this connection makes perfect sense to them. And what I wanted to ask you, Umar, is this, in light of this, and the tours, a couple that I've been with you on, going through destroyed villages where you see that there was wealth. You see, and even with the destruction, you can tell just how wealthy and how beautiful it was, and what was destroyed and what was stolen. How do we make that? How do we bridge that to a place where people can sit and not think you're crazy when you ask them to envision a return and envision the democratic reality of the democratic state in which this return will be possible? How do you bridge that?
Yeah, first of all, I'm not expecting that the whole Israeli society will switch very fast.
I'm not talking about Israelis, I'm talking about the Palestinians. In other words, how do you sit with Palestinians and say, well, let's envision this return? That's what I meant.
I got that, but I just wanted to add one more aspect, one more layer of complicity, that when you ask the former question about looting the property of the Palestinians, it was not only the Zionist institutions or the army or the government. It was also simple people, simple individuals who took part in looting and entering the Palestinian houses and taking their property. Even in one case that seems to be a very simple case, the expulsion of the village in the north of Israel today, very close to the border with Lebanon, called Ikrith, that was expelled politely in the end of 1948, asking the people to move to another Palestinian village, or even to Lebanon if they wish, but they refused. They moved to another Palestinian village for 2 weeks, and the army promised them to come back after they fixed the border with Lebanon. And this promise was not implemented till today, the 2 weeks taking 72 years. But what is interesting, that in the 50s, the Israeli colonials on the land of Ikrith, in the settlements of Shumera and other Jewish moshavs and kibbutzes in the area, sent a letter to David Ben-Gurion telling him that we heard about the option of returning the people of Ekrit. And if you do so, we will leave. If you do so, we will lose the land that we now cultivate and we now use, and we will lose the water spring of Ekrit that we use, and we need that very much. So the obstacle is very hard. Now I'm coming to your question. So the Palestinians, when they think about their what they face on the reality, it's the whole entity of the colonial Zionist in general, not only the government and the army, unfortunately. In one hand, it seems more complicated. In other hand, it means that except the military action, we don't suggest, and we don't have any forces or any military action can change the situation. We do kind of political education. So when we meet the society, we can use different tools, gradual processes in order to crack the Israeli perceptions and show the crimes and the injustice that happened in 1948, and how do the simple Israeli person get benefit from this situation. The Palestinian side, what we started to do with small groups of internal displaced youth inside 1948, asking them to design or to imagine their new villages. I think this is kind of a program that will change the political attitude to the place and to the area. As I said, when they do this practice, they look at their village as a place for return, not only a place of disaster or sorrow. They're going back to this place in order to say, I belong to this place and I want to come back to this place, not only to say I was expelled from this place. I think this is very important. It seems very simple, but this is very important in changing the attitude to the landscape and to the area. I believe that the Palestinians in our small circles, we try to do that, but Palestinians in general and the Palestinian leadership and the PLO should have a program, political program, how they see the return on the future and what is the meaning of the practical return on the ground, and to let the international community open this file again and again, and to put that on the table of the United Nations circles in order to show that return of Palestinians will not cause new expulsion or new disaster even for the colonizers. We can give some options and some solutions. How could the case of Palestine be resolved? A little bit like, for example, the situation in South Africa. It could be a program that will convince the international community that the return not only justice, but also applicable and needed and must be done on the ground. From our experience, we learned to explain the return in positive ways, what even the Israelis could get from the return. For example, many of them will be released of being colonizers and occupiers. They don't want to live all the time as this. Maybe they want to live as equal citizens and equal and normal people. Some of them will catch this point and think positively that return could create a normal situation for citizens or for civilians. The other point that we learned that we can use the term of returns in plural, not only return. because, as I said in the beginning, there are different conditions in different locations in Palestine inside the Green Line 1948. So we can offer that the return and the solution will be different from place to other. It's not the only one way of return or one way of solution. There are many options, and these options gives us the freedom to think in different way about the future.
Okay, well, I think it's time to open up for Q&A, unless there's anything one of you wants to add right now. We have quite a few questions, and we're already, as I thought we would, we're past the time that was allocated originally. So Jamil, would you pick a couple of questions, and maybe 2 or 3 we have time for, and let's see how it goes.
Sure thing. So this first question is from Layla. I would just like to recommend Ghassan Kanafani's story, Return to Haifa, as a wonderful companion to this important topic. It really demonstrates the emotional and confrontational quality of return from one part of Palestine to another. Can anyone on the panel comment on this great work?
Let's move on to something about the return itself. This is a literary question. It's a good question. It's a great book. It's a great story. But yeah, let's.
Okay, this one is from Ian. My mother's family left Haifa in 1948 after the Nakba. They owned a plot of land in Haifa. Will this be documented in the UNCCP archives? And can I access this online?
I can very quickly respond on that. I'm sure the plot of land is included in the UNCCP archive, because at the time refugees, both internally displaced who stayed behind, as well as those who fled to the neighboring countries and territories, were invited to submit information, and so I'm convinced it's there. At the moment, it's not accessible as I mentioned. It has been digitized in the many years ago, but digitized only for preservation purposes, not digitized to turn it into a database that people can access. And that work has started about a decade ago and still needs another 5 years or so before it's complete. It's quietly conducted by the Institute for Palestine Studies. And ultimately, I believe that this work can be combined with the work that UNRWA is doing to further modernize its electronic archives of the Palestinian refugees that were registered for services with the agency. And UNRWA intends to turn that into an online portal where any Palestinian refugee around the world will be able to provide their credentials. You know, you don't automatically get access. You first have to establish that you're a descendant of a Palestinian refugee and provide your current whereabouts, etc. But ultimately, these resources will become accessible, and combined, they constitute an incredibly rich resource that will be available for the pursuit of restitution and compensation claims.
I want to jump in here just a sec, Francesca, and ask you. There's a question here. Despite all the denials and taboos, what legal step could be taken by Palestinian refugee community at large in order to demand enforcement of the resolutions and international law in regard to their rights? Is there something the Palestinians can do en masse as a community?
Well, I think that for a long time, there's been this belief, especially in Arab states, encouraged by Arab rulers, that living in a sort of subhuman conditions without rights. I mean, I'm referring to the millions of Palestinian refugees in the Arab world, especially those in UNRWA's areas of operation, would have led them to the right of return. So enduring the politics of suffering, as American anthropologist Neil Gabiam defines it, was a way to get the right of return. For me, it's the opposite. In the book, we analyze, as we say, the situation of Palestinian refugees around the world at large, where they are. And we have noticed that although, I mean, it's very difficult to map, I mean, to nail down and to find a common denominator which explains the situation of all of them, because the fragmentation is not only physical, is also legal. There are so many legal regimes that end up applying to them without the insurance of a full application of international law. And many of them are deprived of all rights. Many of them live in a sort of limbo as stateless and have been as such for generations. So for me, a step closer to ensure not only the right of return, justice for the Palestinian people as a whole, and justice for those Israelis who believe in this concept of peace, a peace that is enjoyed by all, is to acquire rights, and be empowered. Because the Palestinians have for a long time been in a position, I mean, I say, have been spoken of and spoken about without them really participating in the debate and shaping the narrative that they wanted, as they wanted. Umar was saying that in the beginning. He was saying, eventually, the right of return is also a right, you didn't say that precisely, but it's a right to choose, the right to decide how to get to a dignified life. And until that gap is filled, I see it very difficult for the return and justice to happen. Because for Israel, it's very convenient. The status quo is very convenient. They have, I would like to point to something Miko said, is there a way to, I mean, is there, Israel is as any state, as any sovereign state, has the right to decide who enters and who doesn't enter its own territory, has the right to determine who is a state, who is a citizen of the state and who is not. But again, because of the internationally wrongful act that Israel has committed, at a certain point, Israel should pay. And there are measures to ensure that. There should be a response from the international community. But for it to happen, I do believe that the Palestinians need to get en masse become agent of their own future, and so advocate for their rights first and foremost, and then to create that critical mass that shape political decisions.
Umar, I want to talk to you kind of with maybe a slightly different version of the same question. So in terms of that, is there an agency? Could we envision, create an agency that does that? Because like Francesca was saying, it's true, the fragmentation and the different legal systems under which Palestinian refugees live are countless. So do you have how do we overcome, is there a way to overcome that? How do we overcome that so that there is some kind of a representation that can make the demands in their name? Obviously, without that, nothing can move forward.
Well, in theory, yeah, it seems it makes sense, but unfortunately, it's very risky. We all know that the.
Well, I'm sorry. What is risky?
I'm approaching the point what we can do according to the international law, approaching international organizations or courts might be risky because most of the Palestinians don't trust the international law institutions, and if they do that, or someone will do that on their name, and it will be discussed if they have rights on what kind of rights. We know the dynamic and the power relation in the international circles, and unfortunately how the United Nations decided to divide Palestine, they could decide also to divide the rights. They could be in conditions of pressure to decide the Palestinian refugees. And by the way, some of the Israelis formal arms and the United States Foreign Ministry doing some efforts in the last decade in order to prove that the Palestinian refugees, only the people who were expelled physically from Palestine in 1948, so they can return, but others, they can get compensation or something else. So I'm not sure that this formal action will resolve the problem or will achieve the rights to the Palestinian refugees. By the way, even inside Israel, I mentioned in IDPs, one community of IDPs inside Israel approached Israeli court in order to get back confiscated land. They're saying that the government wanted or confiscated under the excuse to use that for public purposes, and they did not do so for 50 years or 60 years. So we want this land back. And the Israeli court rejected their case, and it became a kind of legal base for other cases. So I think it's still in these political conditions, still not, I don't know, not sure that this is the way that we should be done. It must be done in the political level first, and then unfortunately the law or the rights will be implemented.
Well, as I look, we need to wrap up, but I'll just say, as I'm looking at the screen, I see the four of us and Jamil. I think the book needs to be mandatory for people who deal with Palestine to read. I think it presents a picture that even people who are well versed on the issue of Palestine need to learn about, because there's a lot of ignorance on this issue because it's so legally, complicated, actually, much more than I thought. But on the other hand, it also presents the possibilities because the case is so strong, because the rights are so clear. And Omar, the vision that you and Zochrot present, I think, are a crucial element. What seems to me, and I think, Omar, you alluded to this right now, is that without the kind of political work, we're not going to be able to see any progress. And so I wear this badge, and I think this is the kind of political work that is required, which is boycott, divestment, and sanctions, BDS, because the right of return, of course, one of the demands of the Palestinian call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. So I think that's crucial, and I think this is exactly the combination: understanding the past, understanding the law, working with a clear vision to like you say, create the now, not the utopia or the dystopia, but the now, and then work realistically towards political pressure to bring this about. We do need to finish, so I want to remind everybody the book is called Palestinian Refugees in International Law, right?
Yes. Let me show the cover.
Oh, show the cover, absolutely, yes. It's a lovely cover. Palestinian Refugees in International Law. And so look it up, it's available. It's an incredibly important, I think, study.
And our Facebook page, PRIL 2020, PRIL 2020.
I'm sorry?
That's our Facebook page of the book,
okay.
PRIL 2020.
Okay, so you can check that out. And then we're going to put, maybe you already did put, the link to the Zochrot. Zochrot just launched their fundraiser. And so the link should be in the chat. I really recommend everybody do what they can to share or help. Zochrot does incredible work in Palestine. And with that, I will thank the four of you for your very, very valuable time and your incredible knowledge, and the people who participated, the audience. Jamil, behind the scenes, thank you so much. And Jamil, is there anything else to add before we close? Maybe Jamil is gone.
I think we're all good.
Okay, this will be on mikopeled.com in a few days. So if you want to look at it again, share it, feel free to do so. Thank you all very, very much, everybody. Good day and good night.
Thank you for having us.
Thank
Bye-bye,
you.
everyone.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Thank you.